What's up, everyone? Sam here from Byte.com, and in this video I'm going to share with you an excerpt from my course Coding Interview Mastery System Design. In this video I'm going to show you exactly how to identify what it is that your interviewer is looking for when you're doing a system design problem and how to do that in your interview as effectively as possible. And if you want to learn tons more about system design and how to prepare for these interviews, our course Coding Interview Mastery System Design is open right now at byte.com/SD. In this video, we're going to talk about capturing the constraints of the problem, because this is one of the most important things to do during system design interviews, since our interviewers tend to be so vague about what it is that they actually want. And so we're going to get really detailed here about how we can make sure that we're capturing those constraints as efficiently as possible and not just capturing them, because obviously given unlimited time, you can ask unlimited questions. But the fact of the matter is that we do not have a lot of time in our interview. And so we want to make sure that we're using that time as efficiently as possible. So I'm going to give you some strategies that you can use to make sure that you're capturing the constraints and then also make sure that you are then building the right solution, solving the right problem for your interview. So let's go ahead and dive in here. And the first thing is that it really is critical to understand those constraints, because a lot of times what I see, especially in more technical, in like coding interviews, is that people will, when they don't fully understand the constraints or they don't fully understand what's being asked, they actually end up solving a completely different problem from the one that is posed by their interviewer. And this is obviously a huge problem, because if your interviewer wants one thing and you do something else, that is not a good look. Think about it if, you were working for a company and they said, oh, well, we need to build this, and you built something else. They would not be super happy about that. And so it's really important that we make sure that we understand those constraints as part of this whole demonstrating to our interviewer that we are someone that they would want to work with. And the idea here, and what's really important in doing this, and why I wanted to dedicate a whole video to this topic, is that we want to extract, not just extract the information, but we want to extract as much information with as little effort and with as little time as possible. Because remember, time is a huge constraint in our interview. We don't have a lot of time to go through everything that we need to do. And so the more efficient that we can get about each piece of the interview, the better off we're going to be in general, because we're going to be able to get through those initial phases of the interview faster and have a lot more time to actually build out our solution. And there are also, I mentioned this briefly, but there are also the constraints that are by nature of the interview itself. And we talked a little bit about this earlier in the module about the differences between the real world system design and system design in your interviews. And these are important constraints as well that we need to be aware of. For example, the amount of time that we have. So these are all things that we want to be thinking about as we're going through the interview and making sure that we're using these to our advantage. Because as long as you're aware of what the constraints are, those can actually help you. Constraints don't have to be a bad thing. They can actually help us to be more focused in our interview and make sure that we're doing the right things rather than getting overwhelmed and doing everything. So let's go ahead and get into this. And the first thing that I want to talk about here is the psychic method. And the psychic method is so valuable because this is how you are going to extract as much information from your interviewer as you can, as efficiently as possible. Right? This is how you are going to extract the constraints. You're going to extract what the problem is and what they want you to solve for very efficiently. And the basic idea here is that we want to be able to make accurate assumptions about the system. And so what this means is that if you don't have the right context, you can't make assumptions about the system. You can't say, oh, well, I'm going to assume this to be true. You just have to basically ask your interviewer. And so this is where you get this constant back and forth of constantly asking your interviewer, like, well, what about this? Or what about this? Or what about this? Or what about this? And it's really inefficient. And so if we have the right context, and I'm going to show you how to do this in a second, if you have the right context for the problem that you're solving, you can make assumptions and you can get inside your interviewer's head and make the assumptions that they are already making. Right? Here's the key, is that you are making the assumptions. You can basically make assumptions that you know to be correct because you understand the problem on a deep enough level. And so this makes it way more efficient. It means that you don't have to keep constantly validating your ideas with your interviewer. Keep validating everything that you're going to try, everything that you're going to do with your interviewer, because that takes a lot of time. It really slows down that process. And so let's look at the steps to the psychic method. So step one, we already talked about some of these a little bit, but step one is you want to try and relate the system to something that you're already familiar with. The more in depth you can relate the system to something that you already know, the better. And so the best case scenario here is that your interviewer either asks you to design something a la a given app, or you are able to find an example. And so to go back to our example that we used in a previous video of designing a messaging app, this might look like asking them, rather than designing a messaging app, to design WhatsApp. And so you can ask your interviewer questions about this. Ask them if, there is any sort of corollary here. If there is any similar app, ask them, maybe they might say, oh, maybe you might pick something that is similar to what you think they're asking and say, oh, so, they ask you to design a messaging app. You could ask them, do you want me to design something similar to WhatsApp, or are there any particular things that you want me to focus on that are different than that? Because that gives you a shared point of reference that you can then say, think about it, for example, think about a GitHub repo. In a GitHub repo, every time you make a commit, you are not copying all of the code, right? So you might have a massive repo, but each commit is just that incremental change. And so the commits themselves can be very, very small. And in the same way here, we are looking for what are those incremental differences between the thing that I am already familiar with. So I don't have to understand I don't have to start from the ground up, because you could say, they could say design a messaging app. And you could start from the ground up and try and build up. You could say, okay, well, what kind of messages do we need to send? And they might be all kinds of messages. And then you would say, okay, well, do I need to, so I'm going to say text messages, audio messages, video messages, maybe, I don't know if you guys ever played that game. I don't remember what it's called now, but it's you draw a picture and your friend has to it's like Pictionary, but on your phone. So maybe you want to send picture messages where you're literally, people are drawing. The possibilities are endless when it's so vague. And so if we start with saying, let's design WhatsApp, or let's design something, Facebook Messenger, then we can adjust from there, and we can say, okay, well, do you want me to implement this feature? Do you want me to implement this feature? And we can pare back from that. So start with that, if at all possible, start with a shared frame of reference. The next thing that you can do is, if they don't give you that shared frame of reference, can you define a specific use case that this is going to be for? And so we already talked about the idea of doctors sharing medical records with their colleagues. And that's a specific use case that allows us to do the same thing. That allows us to make specific assumptions about what factors, what is important in the app that we're building, what are the elements that we need to include, what are the things that are maybe lower priority. It allows us to make those assumptions, because we can say, okay, if we're sharing medical records, we know that security is a priority. Right? We know that sharing documents is a priority. Those are sort of the two things that we can say, well, without those, we can't have a messaging app for doctors, right? Those are sort of the minimum viable system, right? The minimum viable aspects of it. And so we can really define, okay, well, what are the key things that we need to build? And then let's go from there. And we can make assumptions. And then finally, if you can't do any of that, and even if you do, but you need more clarity, we talked about this a little bit, but asking broad questions so that you can narrow things down as quickly as possible. It's like if you've ever played the game 20 Questions, you usually start with this, is it a plant, animal, or mineral? Right? You start with these 3 broad categories, which allow you to very quickly narrow down significantly. If they say it's an animal, you've eliminated most things that are out there in the world, right? You've eliminated most options, and so it allows you to get much more specific. Whereas if you started with, oh, is it a rubber duck? Then all of a sudden it's like, well, no, it's not a rubber duck, but it could still be anything else in the world. And so the broader the questions we can ask, again, think about it like binary search. We want to start from the middle and then narrow down from there, rather than saying okay, is it the smallest number? Is it the second smallest number? Is it the third smallest number? That takes us a lot longer. And so the more efficient that we can be about this, the better, and the better we are then able to make assumptions. So that's the psychic method. This is something that I really want you to think about in those early stages of the interview. The better you get at this, the more efficient the whole interview process is going to be. And then the second piece of this, in terms of the constraints in your interview, is this idea of developing a minimum viable system. And this is so important. This is really based on this idea of a minimum viable product. So if you're familiar at all with sort of, I believe it's The Lean Startup, is a book about, founding mostly tech companies. And he talks about this idea of building a minimum viable product, where rather than building all the features that you think people could want, you build the smallest version of the product so you can just start testing. And the same is true in your interview. You want to build the minimum viable system with the minimum number of features that you need to show your interviewer that you know what you're doing, to show them that you've answered the problem. Because the biggest single constraint in your interview is time. Right? The biggest single constraint you have is the amount of time you have in that interview, because you don't have months to design this system. A lot of times people will tell me like, oh, I saw this video on YouTube of someone designing Netflix. And they went into all this complexity about all these different things. And how am I supposed to come up with that in my interview? And my answer to them is always like, do you really think that they did that whole thing off the cuff in 45 minutes? No, they did all this research beforehand. They planned everything out. And so yes, it's a good way to learn how that system works, but it's not representative of what that interview is going to look like. In the interview, at best, you can focus on a couple key features, a couple key aspects of the system that are going to be most important. And so what you want to do is you want to prioritize, and you want to figure out what are those aspects of the system that they most want you to focus on, and just build out those. You can acknowledge other things that you might need to build. You could even make a list of like, oh, well, if I had more time, I would build out this, and this. But you have to focus on a couple things. Because you really, at the end of the day, you can't build out everything. You got to focus on a couple key features. And I want you to think about like, what are the most important features? What are the features that without these features, the app that they're asking me to build wouldn't actually be the thing that they're asking me to build, right? So like for a messaging app, let's go back to this example. You could build out a user authentication tool. You could build out the logging in using OAuth. You could build out the, finding, connecting with your friends. But if you don't build out sending message from person A to person B, it's not a messaging app, right? Fundamentally, the only thing that you need for a messaging app is you need for one person to be able to send a message to another person. Yes, there are lots of other things we'd like to be able to build too, but if you think about it, if you don't build out the sending the message, you didn't answer the question. And so when we're thinking about this minimum viable system, we want to think about, again, what are those most important features? Maybe pick 3. Maybe it depends on the specific thing you're building, because those features may be simple or very complicated. But what it allows you to do is you start with that simple feature, and then you say to your interviewer, I could either go deeper on this. We talked about this, going deeper on the interface layer, the data layer, or the storage layer, or you could just build out another feature at a high level. And so you can continue to go deeper in this way, but you need to start with that minimum viable system. This is one of the biggest mistakes that I see people make, is they try and do too much with the time they have, and they run out of time. And so with that, thinking about how do I understand what exactly it is that my interviewer is asking for, and then how do I build the minimum version of that, the most concise version of that, is really going to, just using these 2 strategies, is going to take your interviewing to a whole new level. So I highly encourage you to try that out. I think you're going to find this really useful, and I look forward to seeing you in the next video.
Thanks again for sticking around to the end here. Again, if you want to learn a ton more about system design and how to prepare for these types of interviews, go over to bytebybyte.com/SD to check out our entire course, Coding Interview Mastery System Design. It's open until December 16th, and I hope to see you inside.